Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome. I'm Alastair Stewart, and for the next 2 hours I'll be keeping you company on TV and radio with the stories that really matter all over the country and across the world. We have plenty coming up this afternoon. Two major topics to discuss today. The cost of living crisis right here, with rocketing energy and fuel prices we're having to pay, plus the frustrations and doubts that those trying to help Ukrainian refugees are facing. And, of course, we will be discussing the ongoing Westminster crisis with a whole host of expert guests to answer your questions and concerns on things that really matter. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the news. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you, Alistair. It's 1 minute past 12. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Police searching for a woman who went missing a week ago in Lancashire say they've found a body. Katie Kenyon was last seen getting into a Ford Transit van in Burnley 8 days ago. Officers say formal identification is yet to take place, but the family of the 33-year-old mother of two have been informed of the discovery. A senior Tory MP says Conservative whips took too long to react over allegations Neil Parish watched pornography in the Commons. Caroline Noakes, who chairs the Women and Equalities Committee, accused them of dither and delay by leaving it until Friday. Mr Parish has not denied watching porn in the Commons, but suggests he may have opened the video accidentally. He's rejecting calls to stand down, saying he'll wait for the outcome of a parliamentary standards inquiry. Mr Parish was interviewed by GB News 3 days ago before it emerged that he was the MP at the centre of the story.
I mean, I think the Whip's office will do a thorough investigation and we will wait and see that result. And I think, from that, then the decision will have to be made what action to be taken.
Labour is accusing a Conservative MP of wasting police time following calls for an investigation into claims Sir Keir Starmer broke COVID rules during lockdown. The Shadow Education Secretary told GB News Tory MPs were trying to pull the party into the gutter ahead of the local elections. Police have investigated the gathering, which took place at a constituency office in Durham in April last year, and decided no rules were broken. Bridget Phillipson says there's no comparison between that and the Downing Street parties.
Police have looked into the matter. There's no case to answer. No rules were broken. I can see why Tory MPs ahead of the local elections want to spend their time seeking to drag us all into the gutter and make out that we're all the same. But really, you look at the number of fines that have been issued at Downing Street. The fact that the Prime Minister lied to the British people, that he's lied to Parliament, that we've got the only Prime Minister in modern times to have broken the law to still be in office, and understand just why they're getting so desperate around this. Tory MP should know better than to waste police time on this.
The acting Premier of the British Virgin Islands insists there's no need for London to impose direct rule over the territory. It follows an inquiry set up in the wake of corruption allegations against the Premier, Andrew Fahey. He has appeared in a US court overnight over alleged drug trafficking and money laundering charges. The US has accused the Russian President Vladimir Putin of brutality and depravity in his 2-month invasion of Ukraine. A Pentagon spokesman says violent and cruel acts have been committed against innocent civilians with utter disregard for their lives. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence says Moscow has been forced to merge and redeploy depleted military units after failed advances in northeast Ukraine. The brother of Kyiv's mayor, Vladimir Klitschko, says he's seen evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine.
Tortured, executed bodies of civilians with their hands tied behind their back on their knee and executed with the headshots. I've seen it with my own eyes, many, hundreds of dead civilians. It's just horrifying.
Meanwhile, the city of Mariupol is still under siege, with Russian forces focusing on the steelworks where hundreds of troops and civilians are still stranded. Footage has emerged of Ukrainian soldiers in the steel plant singing the national anthem. It's as Ukraine's military say Russian forces continue to attack the eastern Donbass region, but have so far failed to capture 3 target areas. Here, a cross-party committee is warning reforms are needed to stop hostile states buying access to MPs through all-party parliamentary groups. It comes after MI5 revealed that a female spy had been instrumental in setting up the Chinese in Britain group. The Commons Standards Committee has warned significant changes are needed to avoid what they're calling the next great parliamentary scandal. The Met Police is launching a new bid to overturn a High Court ruling which found officers breached the rights of organisers of the Sarah Everard Vigil in 2021. Scruffles broke out at the event between police and some of those taking part in the vigil. Reclaim These Streets was criticised for spending more taxpayer money after Scotland Yard said it would take the case to the Court of Appeal. However, the Met says its appeal focuses on decisions and communications with Reclaim These Streets ahead of the event. In the US, a bid to overturn Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking conviction has failed. That's despite her lawyers arguing that one of the jurors was biased after he failed to disclose he was a victim of sexual abuse. The judge concluded the juror was fair and impartial in the original court case. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Alistair.
Olivia, thank you very much indeed. Coming up this afternoon on Alastair Stewart and Friends, we're discussing a whole host of different topics today. Firstly, the cost of living here, as the rises in fuel and energy prices continue to hit hard. In a recent survey, the Office for National Statistics found that 4 in 10 adults are cutting back on buying food in order to help save costs. We'll have all of the latest analysis on that. Plus, we'll be discussing the frustrations of those who are doing everything they can to help Ukrainian refugees. The government has recently announced 2 schemes to do more to help those fleeing the country, but there's much criticism from those desperate to help over the painfully slow process. We'll be speaking to a Ukrainian MP, plus a couple of people who've been there on the ground offering their goodwill. And the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has announced this week that 8,000 British troops will be deployed to Eastern Europe. He said they're committed to taking part in exercises across Eastern Europe to combat Russian aggression in one of the largest deployments since the Cold War. I'll be discussing that this hour with a retired British Army Major. And of course, we'll be discussing the recent developments on Tory MP Neil Parish as he's being investigated over claims that he was watching pornography in the House of Commons and in a committee hearing this week. Now, as always, I want to hear from you on those subjects and anything else you think that we're perhaps missing out on. You can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. We are also on Twitter, as indeed am I, and Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on previous programmes and what's going on right now. Now, here at GB News, we call ourselves the People's Channel because we genuinely try to drill into what's on your minds and seek answers for you. Two very different subjects appear to be front and centre of your concerns right now, so we're taking them both on. The cost of living here, especially those rocketing fuel and energy prices that we're all having to pay right now, and the frustrations so many feel who are trying to help Ukrainian refugees only to hit a brick wall. I'm delighted to be joined now by a former head of communications at Number 10, who's also an economist, so he knows a little bit about what governments can and can't do, particularly on the economy and what's happening in the oil markets. I'll also be talking on that subject to an economics professor too from the great Warwick University Business School and a spokesman from the Institute of Economic Affairs. That's a bit later on. Top British businessman Sir John Mills joins me towards the end of the programme. Now, as the UK commits a further 8,000 troops to NATO's eastern flank, I'll be asking that former British Army Major General what it means strategically. He's also a logistics man, so I'll ask him why we can't get more refugees here from Ukraine if we can get all of the weaponry and troops in that direction. Two friends of mine have been doing their bit to help the refugees, but have faced all manner of obstacles. As Penny Mordaunt and I discussed last weekend, the government really risks losing your goodwill, the goodwill of the British people, if this refugee problem isn't sorted out soon. I'll be talking to a Ukrainian MP and ask if she's got any ideas for our MPs. And finally, as a British MP is investigated for watching pornography on his mobile phone in the House of Commons and in a committee meeting, it's reported that a growing number of MPs are being investigated for inappropriate sexual behaviour. Another is suspended for bullying, and the Labour leadership stands accused of not telling the full truth about a gathering in Durham, who was there and whether or not it breached the rules governing COVID lockdowns. We'll be mulling over what it means for the respect that you still have for Parliament, if you have any, and politics, and indeed politicians. As always, we welcome your thoughts and ideas. Let me repeat it. Email them at gbviews@gbnews.uk, tweet us, or me, and there's also Facebook. So let's get the conversation underway with Jonathan Haslam, CBE, former Chief Communications Secretary to John Major, and on the right of your screen there, George Basinski, who's a political journalist and commentator, but also, intriguingly, the Chief Advisor to the UK's parliamentary all-party group on Poland. And the Poles are facing an even tougher energy problem crisis as Russia turns off the taps. Jonathan, let me start with you, having been at the very heart of government at Number 10 when there were several crises. When you've got allegations of MPs watching pornography in the House, sexual harassment, bullying and all the rest of it, when our politics falls into disrepute and contempt, we have a really serious problem.
I think we do have a really serious problem, Alistair. You're absolutely right. Politicians don't have a great rating, slightly ahead of estate agents and around about the same level as journalists, which is unfortunate. And where we are at the moment is a huge double whammy in many instances. We'll talk about cost of living in a moment, but we have the recovery from COVID as an economic issue, and then we have the disruption from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That's two very big hits that people have to take account of. And I think many people watching the programme will really be concerned about is Parliament appears to be consumed with itself. It appears to be about me, the MP. And it really doesn't seem to have pulled together in a way you would expect in the face of the two dramatic challenges that the country faces. That's what we look forward to. And when it comes to someone like Mr. Parish, for example, I think he'll be gone by the end of the week. I think he should be gone already, just because the signal that's sent out from his behaviour is, first of all, outrageous. It's disrespect for the House of Commons. It's disrespect for women. That's the most important thing. And really and truly, he's got a problem. I think that it was interesting. Lord Bethell was talking about, actually, this could be a rather more prevalent issue than we imagine.
Junior Minister.
Yeah, and a former junior minister. Yeah, so he pointed out he had to upbraid somebody on the tube for watching pornography with, women and other people around him. And it's
Let
quite
me bring George
astonishing.
in. Because as I said in the introduction, you're a political commentator in your own right, but you also work cheek by jowl with these people in the all-party committee, so you know MPs and what makes them tick. But in your experience, have you ever seen it this bad?
Actually, no. I think it has been piling up, and I think what annoys people the most is that there seems to be a different rule for the politicians and a different rule for all of us. And it's connected to every single scandal, I think, that we've been talking about. Just look at Partygate, right? Maybe it wasn't such a big issue. A few politicians broke certain rules that they imposed. But where was the scrutiny? Why didn't we deal with that on day one? And as it has been said here already, why an MP like Neil Parish is not scrutinised straight away? The committee should take this case on day one. Of course, let him stay out his arguments and he has a defence. We live in a democracy. But he said he clicked something by accident. That doesn't really happen. I mean, you need to search for something to find it. You don't open links by accident of that nature. So it is very dodgy, and we should have been dealing with it much quicker. And I think that's what annoys people, because people make mistakes.
Sure.
Sometimes people are accused of something that they haven't committed. And I'm sure some of the cases in Parliament, because I think there are over 50 MPs that are accused of all sorts of inappropriate behaviour. Some of them are clean and innocent, but we should be dealing with that much quicker. The longer this case is on the news for weeks and weeks, it brings embarrassment to not just one party, to all the politicians.
That's exactly the point. And I put it to Jonathan, I'll put it back to you as well, because what strikes me, and I've been in this game for a long time, he and I knew each other decades ago when you were working for John.
Right.
And to me, as a Democrat, doesn't matter whether I'm left, right or in the middle, but as a Democrat, respect for politics and respect for Parliament are sacrosanct. And I personally have, even the expenses scandal, I've never known it quite this bad.
Yeah, and you look at various corporate jobs. I mean, if somebody is caught watching porn or doing something extremely inappropriate, he's not coming to work the next day. Straight away, this case is analysed and he may be fired the next day. He's not coming in and saying hello to his female co-workers and others. It's just not the same for politicians. And I think that's why people are furious.
OK,
I think you were right, if I may, Alistair, just to draw up expenses. Because in terms of toxicity and the way in which the public are regarding politicians, and you and I know perfectly well, there are many, many incredibly dedicated politicians who are being tarred by this. And they should be queuing up outside the Whip's office saying, this must be dealt with, because our institution, particularly when it's in the highlight of a Ukraine invasion by a totalitarian state, the imperative for us to show that we are better, that democracy works, that MPs can represent people. Surely the premium on that has just gone through the roof, like other expenses. But nonetheless, without any other hesitation, I would just say we have an enormous privilege in this country, and the people, 650 of them in Parliament, uphold it. And I want the good ones to really stand up and shout for it at the moment.
On the cost of living crisis, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, said in the spring statement, I can't do everything, as he cut fuel duty by 5p and put more money into helping folk deal with rising energy prices. As someone who knows the inner workings of government, but also knows a bit about economics, should he have done more at this juncture?
I think he could have done some things that were different. 5p...
That's different to more.
It's where you apply the more. I think we have to look for the poorest in our society. I think we have to look at universal credit. You have to ask the question of whether the £20 uplift in face of COVID was the right thing to do when it was got rid of. I don't think it was. I think it would have sent out a very strong signal for support for people who are suffering. And 5p off a litre of petrol really doesn't cut it when it's 165p to 179p for diesel. So, I mean, it's not going to make a huge difference. So you look where you concentrate your effort, and you do ask those questions about the good thing that he did was the national insurance increase where he changed the thresholds. And I think that was a positive thing to do. The thing about fuel that struck me was, actually, I thought it was too political. He was trying to bite off a part of a constituency that really doesn't need to be bought off. The energy companies are doing OK out of it. The Treasury's doing OK out of it. And there are wider questions about balances there that we need to think about. If you look at some of the papers today, the other thing that strikes me is for savers who have suffered over the years of very, very low interest rates, there should have been a bit of an uplift. And that is a counterbalance to what else is going on. The banks aren't giving you, the high street banks are not giving you the extra money that has been raised through the interest rate raising by the Bank of England. And I think they've got to wake up and actually say, you know, we could make stonking profits, yes, but actually we really need to look after our savers and borrowers.
As I said in the introduction, the people of Poland, which is the area that you advise MPs upon, are facing much tougher times on the energy front at the moment, with Russia, in effect, having switched the tap off. But when you look at what the UK government is doing, do you feel that they should have done more? Or is there a wisdom in holding the line, perhaps until October, and keeping a weather eye on borrowing as much as reducing prices and helping folk out?
I think should have done more is the correct statement, because when you look at Poland, the Baltics and other countries that are neighbouring Russia, they have been warning for years or even for decades about the issues that we all may be blackmailed by Russia in the future. And many people in the West, including in the UK, completely dismissed those important warnings. They said, well, what's going to happen? You know, we don't believe it. But countries such as Poland learned the lesson. So for the last 10, 20 years, they were looking at the widest diversification of energy as possible. So luckily, this year, there will be a new gas pipe, Baltic pipe, opened that imports gas from Norway through Denmark to Poland. These are some of the things that if we hadn't thought about them 10 or 20 years ago, now we would have been in big trouble. And many of the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, they had contracts signed during the Soviet era and even after with Gazprom for the next 20 years, and they couldn't get out of these contracts. So it was much more difficult for Poland and others to get out of these contracts and now to have some sort of independence, or at least a strive for energy independence. UK had much more possibilities to get more liquefied gas contracts. So many other options were out there, and I think a lot of good has been done.
Sure, but let me butt in and bring both of you in, but carry on with you first and then Jonathan come in on it as well. We've lived through and reported upon oil crises back in the 70s and the 80s, and ways are found of doing it. But as far as Eastern Europe particularly is concerned, Poland and all of those other countries that used to be a part of the Soviet Union empire, Warsaw Pact defensively, Comecon economically, they've had since 1989, 1990 to sort it out. You could argue so too have we. I mean, really, globally, Europe's taken its eye off the ball, that Russia was emerging as a major energy economy that could use it as a lever of power diplomatically.
Yes, and the worst was that Germany was in the pocket of Russia and still, to some extent, is. And it's visible from the beginning of the conflict. It's when the war started, when Russia attacked Ukraine, Germany was delaying sanctions. There was that quote, the Ukrainians have stated that a German ambassador, a German minister stated that, why should we support you with weapons? You will lose this war so quickly, it's pointless. Apparently this was a real quote and shows you the mentality. So a lot of the Germans thought that Russia would just take over Ukraine in a few days and we would get back to business and we would finish the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline and everything should be fine and Germany would be that junior partner. But what happened instead is that a lot of Europe allowed itself to be in this submissive position to Russia, and it's terrible because it affects us.
Total lack of strategic thinking across Europe.
I think we've been seduced because we're a peace-loving continent, generally speaking, and I think that people would naturally have been wearied after all those years of Cold War and the deprivations. I think George was being a bit harsh on Germany. I think Scholz really has stepped up to the plate because canning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a very, very big change about.
I didn't butt in because I think he was implying that Angela Merkel and Schröder before her didn't step up to the
No, they didn't. And I think that was a fact. I think we should give Germany credit for, and Scholz particular credit for what he's done. And when you look at our own situation, we do have to ask questions about why on earth have we taken 20 years to decide where we're going with nuclear power? It's great that we have renewables, but actually we do need to underpin our load, our base load, with a nuclear capability. And we're going to see the stations going offline recently. Germany's losing 3. That was another classic strategic mistake.
Sure.
And there are things that can be done. But the most important thing, Alistair, is that we have now had the biggest wake-up call in this century. And there's a price to be paid for expensive gas, and it's a price of freedom. And what we really need to do now is to admit our 8,000 troops is just a drop in the ocean. We are going to have to beef up our military forces.
Talking about
deterrents.
next. You two come back at 1 o'clock. We'll carry on the conversation, pick up on Ukrainian refugees and the military situation and how worried we should be about what's happening on NATO's eastern flank. For the time being, Jonathan and George, thank you both very much indeed. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends, and we've lots more coming up on today's programme, including, as I just said, we'll be speaking to a retired Major General and military logistics expert on that news that 8,000 British Army troops are being deployed to Eastern Europe this summer. But first, let's bring you right up to date with the weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking wet across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but dry for England and Wales. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into southwest England, and it's looking like a fine afternoon with plenty of bright or sunny spells. Feeling pleasant in the sunshine with highs of 14 Celsius. It's a similar picture across southeast England and the London area with plenty of hazy sunshine. Feeling warm with highs reaching 17 Celsius. Over to Wales, and splashes of rain will begin to arrive over Anglesey. Elsewhere, it should be dry with spells of sunshine, highs reaching 16 Celsius. The Midlands will remain dry and bright, but cloud cover will increase across northwest England. The risk of some rain arriving later on in the afternoon, but still warm for many. We will lose the blue skies across northeast England and replace them with grey as rain edges closer to the area. Feeling pleasant in any brighter spells though, but cooler when the rain arrives. It's a different picture than of late for Scotland, with breezy and wet weather for many parts. The rain heaviest over the Highlands, feeling cool with highs of 11 Celsius. The wet weather also extends across Northern Ireland with brisk winds over the hills and around the coasts. Temperatures reaching low double figures, so feeling quite cool for late April. Through the rest of the day, the rain continues to make slow progress southwards, with southern England staying dry. That's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GBNews.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's inching towards 12:30. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News, TV and radio. About 8,000 British Army troops are to take part in exercises across Eastern Europe to combat Russian aggression in one of the largest deployments since the end of the Cold War. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, announced the deployment and said that they are committed to exercises along NATO's eastern border, from Finland in the north to Macedonia in the south. He also committed many more tanks and armoured vehicles to the growing Russian aggression and the response to it. Well, joining me now to discuss that and more, I'm delighted to say, is Major General Tim Cross. Tim's a retired Ordnance Battalion commander and the officer who ran the logistics for the 1st Armoured Division in the First Gulf War. Tim, good of you to join us, and thank you. Ordnance and logistics, perfect. Are the Ukrainians getting all that they need from us and all that they need to win this war, as Zelensky says, with Russia?
Well, they're certainly getting a lot of stuff from the West in the round. Whether they're getting enough to win a war depends what you mean by win. And one of the things that worries me, I have to say, is some of the statements that are being made publicly by people about what they think it could be the outcome of this, as in pushing Russia out of Ukraine completely, including Crimea, including the eastern provinces and so on, which I think is very unlikely. We might come back to that. But overall, we have Tim, it's so important. I had got it down as a question for later on, but you raise it now. You're referring directly to the Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Secretary, in a major speech, said our commitment now is not only defeating Russia in its eastern incursion, but out of Ukraine altogether. That fundamentally changes the nature of the war. It does. It does. And I'm not having a go at her in particular, because she's not the only one. And I have to say, from President Biden downwards, what I've been dismayed about in this last couple of weeks is, and I need to be careful here, I don't want to be sweepingly judgmental, but there's far too much megaphone diplomacy, grandstanding, hubris. We need to get back to some quiet statecraft and get beyond the rhetoric and begin to open up channels of communication. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we need to do anything other than support Ukraine as best we can, and to enable Ukraine to do everything they can to stop the Russian advances, and yes, indeed, to push them back. And if they can do it on their own, then maybe they can push further forward. But the trouble is that by this megaphone diplomacy and the sort of statements that are being made in the Mansion House and elsewhere, is that the Russian paranoia, which we really need to understand. Sun Tzu made a statement 2,500 years ago, which said, if you understand your enemy and you understand yourself, then you need not have the fear of the outcome of 1,000 battles. We need to understand Putin. We may not like him, but he is what he is. And Russia historically has had paranoia about being surrounded by the West and so on. So these exercises you talk about, which actually are relatively small, we can come back to that, nonetheless will play into that paranoia.
Putin also, whether it's fueled by the paranoia that you observe or whether it's an argument with his generals and his security people, but is said to be poised to switch from a special operation in Ukraine to war, quote, unquote. As a military man, Tim, what's the significance of that?
Well, for Russia, from a Russian perspective, it means he can mobilize far more capability, far more fighting power, what we call fighting power. That's the stuff and the way that you conduct these operations. And we don't need to go over the past, but there's no doubt in my mind that they genuinely believe that they would have a relatively easy move into Ukraine, as they've done elsewhere. Relatively easy. That hasn't happened. And he has got to put in more capacity, more capability, and by declaring it as a war, part of Russian military doctrine is a preparedness to use tactical nuclear weapons as part of the escalate to de-escalate. And, pushing Putin, trying to push Putin out of Ukraine will only result in him putting more into ensuring that that doesn't happen. And in my view, he might well be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. One of the problems is we have lost an understanding of what we used to call, in the good old days, in inverted commas, during the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, strategic nuclear deterrence, and the escalation process that happened. The move through conventional fighting, through conducting operations in those days in Western Germany, to a preparedness to escalate into tactical and then more operational level and then strategic nuclear exchange. And an understanding of that doctrine on both sides, with lots of academics involved, with the military certainly involved, and indeed politicians, meant that that Cold War ended in the way that it did, thankfully. Now, we need to be jolly careful that we don't end up with Putin having no alternative than to escalate, as I say.
The final question on that, a man you know very well, also retired General Mike Jackson on this programme, about a month ago said, I always believed that even tactical nuclear weapons would not be used in my lifetime. I'm no longer so sure.
Yeah, I know General Mike extremely well. I worked with him a lot over the years, including during the Balkans and Kosovo and so on. He's an extremely capable operator, and alongside General Rupert Smith, I think probably the best operators of my military generation. I work with both of them a lot. And Mike is right. And I am not saying for 1 minute that I approve of what Putin thinks, or that I don't think we should be putting pressure on, as I say, to succeed in Ukraine. But understanding and defining what it is we hope to achieve, what is our intent, understanding Russia, understanding Putin. If we're not careful, this, as I say, megaphone diplomacy, a lack of statecraft, too much grandstanding and too many statements all competing with each other to say that we're going to give more than you, et cetera, is not going to help. We need to tone down this conversation. Otherwise, Mike, and I have to say myself, will be proven to be right. And God help us if we are.
General Tim, on that sobering thought, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Major General Tim Cross there, retired British Army officer, military logistics expert, with a chilling warning. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends. Plenty more still to come this afternoon, including we'll be talking about the latest developments in Ukraine with friends of the show who've travelled there to offer help. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the news today. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you. It's 25 minutes to 1. Here's the latest in the GB newsroom. Police searching for a woman who went missing a week ago in Lancashire say they've found a body. Katie Kenyon was last seen getting into a Ford Transit van in Burnley. Officers say formal identification is yet to take place, but the family of the 33-year-old mother of two have been informed of the discovery. A senior Tory MP says Conservative whips took too long to suspend Neil Parish over pornography allegations. Caroline Noakes, who chairs the Women and Equalities Committee, accused them of dither and delay by leaving it until Friday. Mr Parish has not denied watching porn in the Commons, but suggests he may have opened the video accidentally. He's rejecting calls to stand down, saying he'll wait for the outcome of a parliamentary standards inquiry. The US has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of brutality and depravity in his 2-month invasion of Ukraine. A Pentagon spokesman says violent and cruel acts have been committed against innocent civilians with utter disregard for their lives. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence says Moscow has been forced to merge and redeploy depleted military units after failed advances in northeast Ukraine. Labour is accusing a Conservative MP of wasting police time following calls for an investigation into claims Sir Keir Starmer broke COVID restrictions during lockdown. Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson told GB News Tory MPs were trying to pull the party into the gutter ahead of the local elections. Police have investigated the gathering, which took place at a constituency office in Durham in April last year, and decided no rules were broken. A cross-party committee is warning reforms are needed to stop hostile states buying access to MPs through all-party parliamentary groups. It comes after MI5 revealed that a female spy had been instrumental in setting up the Chinese in Britain group. The Common Standards Committee has warned significant changes are needed to avoid what they're calling the next great parliamentary scandal. TV, online and DAB plus radio. This is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Alistair will be back in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 20 to 1. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News, TV and radio. Robert emails to say, I find it quite sad when I hear reports that Russians only hear what its government claims. Are we any better? All we hear are second-hand reports from Ukraine, whether through your reporters or from your government. Not so. Bear with me. Since the government said it was opening up 2 schemes to help Ukrainian refugees seek sanctuary in the UK, over 130,000 of you have offered to help and host them. But it's been a painfully slow process, so much so that the Home Secretary Priti Patel offered a public apology. Do you accept that apology? Not only is it sad for those who want to come here, but it's frustrating the goodwill of good people here in the UK. As promised to Robert, who emailed me, I'm delighted to say that joining me live now from Ukraine is Kira Rudik, a People's Deputy in the Ukrainian Parliament and the leader of the political party Voice. How lovely to see you again, and thank you very much indeed. On the issue of refugees, particularly the women and their children who want to leave your country to get to safety, how frustrating is it for them to know that getting to the UK is a heck of a lot more difficult than getting to, say, Poland?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Well, of course, it is frustrating. It's first of all frustrating to be a refugee. You know, one of the most desperate moments of this war was when in the bomb shelter I have seen a child, a girl asking her mommy, are we refugees now? So it's a stress, it's a pain, it's a terrifying experience for all of them. So Poland is the first step and the first destination that people are choosing, and then they're looking out of what would be the best for them and their children. And UK is probably one of the farthest countries that my people are going to, and we continue to be grateful to all the people who are supporting us and who are getting our women and children in.
We were talking earlier on about the British commitment of 8,000 more soldiers along the eastern border of NATO and those countries that abut Ukraine. And we read this morning that although matters in Kyiv have calmed down somewhat, the fighting in Donbass and in the southeast is terrifying, the worst that some people have seen. What is your take on what's going on right now? Because I want to answer that accusation that all we do is hear from reporters or government spokespeople. You're a Ukrainian MP. How bad is it in Donbass right now?
It is very bad. Well, you see, Russians are trying to get as much done as possible for a specific date. It's May 9th, the Victory Day. The victory in Second World War, and that's why they are trying to kind of repeat it. And this is why they have an order to march forward, and they are marching forward. And our military, our army is doing everything possible and impossible to stop them. I'm in Kiev right now, and you say it's calmed down. Well, it did not. Recently, when Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of United Nations, was here in Kiev, we had 5 missile strikes on our peaceful city. And there were at least 3 buildings destroyed and at least 3 people killed and 10 wounded. And it was, you know, like after a week and a half of not having the air raid sirens on, it was like, oh, again. And it is terrifying because without Air Force protection, and this is the weapons that we are still waiting to be delivered to Ukraine, it's nowhere in Ukraine where you can feel safe. Nowhere where my people can say, okay, we can exhale right now. Nowhere where the refugees from the east can say, okay, now we can settle down. That's why people are still going to Poland, they're still going to the United Kingdom, because there is no peaceful city in Ukraine. We are constantly under attacks on different areas of our country, constantly. And this is why it's so important that we are getting more and more weapons from our allies, and this is why it would be so important to get this specific Air Force protection that we are getting from the NATO countries, and we are getting it from the United States. We hope that it will be here soon, within the next 2 weeks, because then we will be able to, you know, protect the peace. We are happy to fight where we need to fight, but we also need to have a place where people can feel safe.
Kira Ruddick, it's so good to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed for finding time for us this afternoon, and do please keep in touch. Thank you very much indeed. That's Kira Ruddick,
thank you.
People's Deputy from the Ukrainian Parliament and leader of the Voice Party. Now, joining me now is Andrew Murray. Andrew is a good friend of this programme and of mine. He's a businessman who's been out to Ukraine many times and is just back and joins me on the phone right now. Andrew, were you able to hear what Kira Ruddick was saying?
Absolutely.
What a terrifying picture she paints. It's not calmed down in Kyiv. It's as bad as it ever was, and the Donbass is hellish.
Absolutely. I think you may have seen, I put on my Twitter feeds that the day or so after I left Kyiv, very, very close to the location where I was, there were a number of missile strikes with a number of casualties and fatalities. So I absolutely echo what Kira says. It's not safe anywhere in Ukraine. The Russian forces and Putin has demonstrated that he's got the capability to hit anywhere he wants at any time, and to send missiles into Kyiv at the moment. A senior member of the United Nations was there, shows exactly how they don't care about anything in terms of collateral damage. So yes, there's nowhere in Ukraine that is safe right now.
People who are listening to our conversation, Andrew, on radio rather than watching it on television, we're showing pictures of the debris and the devastation of what is still going on day in, day out, as Kira underlined, even when the Secretary General of the UN is there. But let me put a blunt question to you as well. When you read and hear that humanitarian workers like Paul Urey and Dylan Healy have been seized, arrested and are being held by the Russian military, doesn't that give you and other people pause for thought about going back out there again?
Well, certainly it ought to, and if it hasn't done previously, then it should do now. From my own perspective, what one has to balance the risk to personal, your personal risks to the suffering. And from my perspective, it's not something that I would care to turn a blind eye to. With that said, the operation that I conducted recently to extract 2 vulnerable refugees from the war zone was characterized by speed and security. And I built those 2 parameters into the mission, if I can call it that, from day one. So I was under no illusions about the dangers present in going into Ukraine and to going to the location I was. And in addition, I was fully aware that there are Russian agents, if I can put it that way, who are actively on the lookout for British personnel in that theatre. And so I briefed the people involved in this operation around security measures that I required to be in place in order to make sure that we could have as safe an operation as we possibly could. And I'm pleased to say that they understood that very, very clearly.
When we spoke before, but offline and on air, we talked about Lord Harrington, the new minister, and I suggested maybe you drop him a line. You said, no, hasn't replied, haven't heard anything about. Are relationships between people like you and my next guest, Matt Millen, who's been doing it for Equestrian Relief, improving? Do you see any progress in terms of the government's attitude to trying to help people like you and Matt?
At the highest levels, probably not. But there is a whole strata of people below ministerial level who are reaching out on a personal level. And I'm going to call some people out now, and I think it's probably worth recognising that this wasn't just about me, Andrew Murray, going to Ukraine. This was a joint operation with a number of people. And first and foremost, I really do need to call out a lady by the name of Rabina Qureshi, who is the CEO of a Glasgow-based charity, Positive Action in Housing. Rabina has a long track record in helping refugees, and she's been instrumental in supporting a large number of Ukrainian refugees in country and keeping them going, including the 2 individuals that I met that she put me in touch with. So yes, at that level, things are working well. It's always helpful to have more ministerial buy-in, more support from politicians. And again, whilst Lord Harrington never got back to me, my own MP, Dave Dugan, has been in constant touch with me. Indeed, when I was in Lviv for the first time, I contacted his office, and within 10 minutes, he called me back. And he's been in constant touch ever since. So at that level, yes, the communication channels are opening, and that's a good thing.
Great to hear about an MP who's doing his or her job well and focusing on what matters to constituents. Andrew, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You're a good man and a brave man. Keep in touch, both online and here at GB News. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for what you're trying to do and those who are supporting you in it. Next up, a dear friend of mine from the equestrian world. I just mentioned him in passing in my conversation with Andrew. It's Matt Millen, the co-founder of Ukraine Equestrian Relief, and one of his drivers, Matt Cayley. There he is on the right of your screen, who went on the first trip and is now going on the second next week. But Matt, you first. It's not been as easy as anyone expected. You're hitting 1 or 2 brick walls, aren't you?
Yeah, it's very interesting what your previous guests have said, because it's all going back to the same sort of route, down to the visa route and getting people in. At the moment, I've been speaking to a lot of people who've been in the same boat. I was speaking to the actress Samantha Giles a couple of nights ago. She had a family in place, ready to come in. Everything was sorted out. She couldn't get them in because the visas weren't done. Finally, they have been done, and she's taken her family. But I was speaking with her, saying if she knows of other people, and obviously Mark will tell you more in a minute, we're going back out on Thursday with some more trucks. If the paperwork's there, we can happily bring them back on the trucks. We've got over 43 offers of work, accommodation, in the UK within the equestrian circles. There's so much happening over here, but it's always down to the paperwork, Alistair. We need to get those visas sorted so we can get the people in.
Mark, let me bring you in, as Matt suggested there. He said you're going back out there, you've got it loaded up, you're willing to bring people back if that can be sorted out legally. But does it not worry you, as I said to Andrew just a moment ago, when you read about people like Paul Urey and Dylan Healy, who are volunteers, who are humanitarian workers like your good selves, they are currently being held by the Russian military? That would put the fear of God into me.
No, it doesn't put a fear of God into me at all. It's just frustrating more than anything. We just go and do what we can do. and take aid out there as best we can. That's all we can do. I mean, we're taking 6 lorries this time out with aid, and where we're splitting up into 2 sections to go out and focus mainly on 2 camps south of Helm, where we can take at least £8,000 worth of aid to each of those, and to 2 other camps in Poznan. So we would just do what we can do. That's all, you know, our hands are tied, but we could just take aid out there and be support to them.
While you were chatting there, Mark, we were, for people who listen to our conversation on radio rather than telly, we were showing, I mean, basically warehouses full of stuff and food and fruit and all the rest of it. Who's supporting you?
Oh, we've had so many people from the general public down to all the equestrians out there. There's so many equestrian people that have put in gift aid, that we've got a live auction carrying on as we speak now. And they're pledging all kinds of things, down to lessons, down to hairdressers that are giving haircuts, all walks of life where we're generating aid, and then just the local general public. We've also got involved this time the support for Ukraine Lincolnshire, where we're collecting all our aid from this time, and they're in collaboration with the Polish school in Lincolnshire as well. So yeah, it's coming from every angle going.
Absolutely brilliant. And we were running some pictures of your helpers and supporters there as well. Final question to you, Matt, and it was something I discussed with Andrew as well. He'd written to Lord Harrington, the minister in charge of this effort, and had not made any great progress, but he said his local MP was being incredibly helpful. Are you and Mark and the team getting support from officialdom at all?
It's starting to come through slowly. Stephen, one of our other founders as well, he's been doing quite a bit of that to try and get through. But it's the same situation all the time, Alistair. It's just waiting for them to come back to us. And yes, I understand they're doing the best that they possibly can for the instructions they're getting from Westminster, but they are doing their best. But it's very, very slow coming through, and that's the biggest issue.
Well, I hope also you may have heard earlier on the Kira Rudik, the Ukrainian MP, who said what all of you are doing is just fantastic and very helpful, and the problems out there are still very real. Keep up the good work, guys. Take care of yourself, Mark. And Matt, love to the family. Good to talk to you as always. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, my friend.
We've got lots of them on the programme today, which always raises my spirits. Matt Millen there and Mark Cayley from Ukraine Equestrian Relief, before then, Andrew talking about his personal efforts as well. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends. We've lots more coming up on the programme this afternoon. We'll be discussing if more can be done to ease the cost of living crisis here in the UK, and we'll be delving a little deeper into the global impact that Russian oil and the sanctions is having now on markets around the world. But first, let's bring you up to date with the weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking wet across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but dry for England and Wales. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into southwest England, and it's looking like a fine afternoon with plenty of bright or sunny spells. Feeling pleasant in the sunshine with highs of 14 Celsius. It's a similar picture across southeast England and the London area with plenty of hazy sunshine. Feeling warm with highs reaching 17 Celsius. Over to Wales, and splashes of rain will begin to arrive over Anglesey. Elsewhere, it should be dry with spells of sunshine, highs reaching 16 Celsius. The Midlands will remain dry and bright, but cloud cover will increase across northwest England. The risk of some rain arriving later on in the afternoon, but still warm for many. We will lose the blue skies across northeast England and replace them with grey as rain edges closer to the area. Feeling pleasant in any brighter spells, though, but cooler when the rain arrives. It's a different picture than of late for Scotland, with breezy and wet weather for many parts. The rain heaviest over the Highlands. Feeling cool with highs of 11 Celsius. The wet weather also extends across Northern Ireland with brisk winds over the hills and around the coasts. Temperatures reaching low double figures, so feeling quite cool for late April. Through the rest of the day, the rain continues to make slow progress southwards, with southern England staying dry. That's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome. It's just coming up to 1 o'clock. If you've just joined us, a very good afternoon to you. If you've been with us since 12, thank you very much indeed. I'm Alastair Stewart and we're into the final hour of the programme. I'll be keeping you company on TV and radio with plenty more still to come, including more on our top discussions about energy, about oil and the continuing crisis in Ukraine. We'll also hear what you think later on in the programme. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the news today. Here's Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you, Alistair. Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Police searching for a woman who went missing a week ago in Lancashire say they've found a body. Katie Kenyon was last seen getting into a Ford Transit van in Burnley 8 days ago. Officers say formal identification is yet to take place, but the family of the 33-year-old mother of two have been informed of the discovery. A senior Tory MP says Conservative whips took too long to react over allegations Neil Parish watched pornography in the Commons. Caroline Noakes, who chairs the Women and Equalities Committee, accused them of dither and delay by leaving it until Friday. Mr Parish has not denied watching porn in the Commons, but suggests he may have opened the video accidentally. He's rejecting calls to stand down, saying he'll wait for the outcome of a parliamentary standards inquiry. Mr Parish was interviewed by GB News 3 days before it emerged he was the MP at the centre of the story.
I mean, I think the Whip's office will do a thorough investigation and we will wait and see that result. And I think, from that, then the decision will have to be made what action to be taken.
An MP has accused Labour of hypocrisy for saying he was wasting police time for calling for an investigation into claims Sir Keir Starmer broke COVID rules during lockdown. The Labour leader is accused of drinking beer at a gathering in Durham. Richard Holden says Labour spent months calling for an investigation into exactly the same kind of event in Downing Street and Whitehall. But Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson says there's no comparison between what Sir Keir did and the Downing Street parties.
Police have looked into the matter. There's no case to answer. No rules were broken. I can see why Tory MPs ahead of the local elections want to spend their time seeking to drag us all into the gutter and make out that we're all the same. But really, you look at the number of fines that have been issued at Downing Street, the fact that the Prime Minister lied to the British people, that he's lied to Parliament, that we've got the only Prime Minister in modern times to have broken the law to still be in office, and understand just why they're getting so desperate around this. Tory MP should know better than to waste police time on this.
The acting Premier of the British Virgin Islands insists there's no need for London to impose direct rule over the territory. It follows an inquiry set up in the wake of corruption allegations against the Premier, Andrew Fahey. He has appeared in a US court last night over alleged drug trafficking and money laundering charges. The US has accused the Russian President Vladimir Putin of brutality and depravity in his 2-month invasion of Ukraine. A Pentagon spokesman says violent and cruel acts have been committed against innocent civilians with utter disregard for their lives. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence says Moscow's been forced to merge and redeploy depleted military units after failed advances in northeast Ukraine. The brother of Kyiv's mayor, Vladimir Klitschko, says he's seen evidence of war crimes in Ukraine.
Tortured, executed bodies of civilians with their hands tied behind their back on their knee and executed with the headshots. I've seen it with my own eyes, many, hundreds of dead civilians. It's just horrifying.
Meanwhile, the city of Mariupol is still under siege, with Russian forces focusing on the steelworks, where hundreds of troops and civilians are stranded. Footage has emerged of Ukrainian soldiers in the steel plant singing the national anthem. It's as Ukraine's military say Russian forces continue to attack the eastern Donbas region, but have so far failed to capture 3 target areas. Here in the UK, a cross-party committee is warning reforms are needed to stop hostile states buying access to MPs through all-party parliamentary groups. It comes after MI5 revealed that a female spy had been instrumental in setting up the Chinese in Britain group. The Commons Standards Committee has warned significant changes are needed to avoid what they're calling the next great parliamentary scandal. The Met Police is launching a new bid to overturn a High Court ruling which found officers breached the rights of organisers of the Sarah Everard Vigil in 2021. Scuffles broke out at the event between police and some of those taking part in the vigil. Reclaim These Streets has criticised the force for spending more taxpayer money after Scotland Yard said it would take the case to the Court of Appeal. But the Met says its appeal focuses on decisions and communications with Reclaim These Streets ahead of the event. In the US, a bid to overturn Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking conviction has failed. That's despite her lawyers arguing that one of the jurors was biased after he failed to disclose he was a victim of sexual abuse. The judge concluded the juror was fair and impartial in the original court case. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Alistair.
Olivia, thank you very much indeed. I am Alastair Stewart, and until 2 o'clock I'll be keeping you company along with friends and friendly guests. Still to come, is Parliament losing the authority to do anything of significance on the economy? We'll be discussing more of the things that really matter to us and our livelihoods. How much things are costing us now and the decisions made by the government that impact upon it. And speaking of the cost of living, what about energy and oil at the pounding heart of it? I'll be speaking to people who really know what the likelihood is of Russia using oil further as a trading weapon and the potential alternatives. Plus, are you one of the almost 1 million women who've suffered due to the shortage of HRT products? With a new task force set up to deliver hormone replacement therapy products, how do the manufacturers go about upscaling the distribution of the specific medications that women need most? GB News is all about you, our viewers. Any burning questions or stories you think we need to cover, no matter how big or small, we genuinely want to hear them. Get your voice heard by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk, and do please put Alastair Stewart in the subject line. We are also on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there, GB News. Now, away from some of the noise in Westminster, let's try and drill down a little bit now on what matters to us and our livelihoods and what the state of the economy really is and how much things are costing us here in the UK. Fuel prices, energy prices, the list goes on. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Jonathan Haslam, former Chief Communications Secretary to John Major, and also there on the right of your screen, George Basinski, Chief Advisor to the UK Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on Poland. I want to pick up on almost where we left off. Is Parliament losing its authority because of all of that noise that we've been discussing, and it was in Olivia's news bulletin there, to really do anything? Is it in danger on the economy, George, of becoming a bystander?
I think systems should be improved, whether we spoke about ethics or whether we spoke about anything that's related to Parliament. It's just very worrying that whatever the case is, whatever the problem is, it takes ages for it to be dealt with. I think this is something that we really ought to start speaking about. And I'm just worried that there is this... when I speak to people on the streets, they just increasingly feel that there is a difference between them and the politicians in Parliament, whether they're from the right or the left, that they're not represented enough. And I think system ought to be changed.
As an observer, Jonathan, there are two schools of thought about us and them. One is it's just a brilliant line from Labour and it's a good way of bashing Boris Johnson and his government. But as George just said, increasingly chatting to ordinary folk, it's the reality. That is how they perceive it, rightly or wrongly.
Oh, I think it is how people perceive it, absolutely. And if you look at the housing crisis, if you look at the cost of living issues that we're facing, Sunak's right in one respect, saying we can't solve everybody's problems. A little bit more humility around it would help. The fact is we can live with an extraordinarily rich Chancellor, but his authority is damaged by all of the issues with his wife's status. It's very sad, but that's life in modern politics. You know, the position of your wife is something that can be commented upon. And let's face it, as a Chancellor, he could have affected non-dom status regulations. And so there are whole issues that come from that. And George is absolutely right. What we've got here is a mismatch. We said earlier in the programme, Alistair, at a different segment, that politicians look like they're constantly internalising, particularly on the Tory side, and it's not making any headway on the ground. It's not going to be anything other than a big issue in the local elections this coming Thursday. So there is a problem. They can do things. They do have the authority to change taxes. They do have the authority to impose windfall taxes. Not a route that I'd like to go down, but it's there to be taken. What we really want is complete honesty about where we are. And that's an openness of a dialogue. And actually, that can come from both sides. And I don't think we're getting that to the extent that we should do.
Yeah. Let me weave those two thoughts together. The opinion polls, I think now 3 on the trot, have shown that folk out there, when asked by pollsters, I've never been asked by a pollster, but we all know that scientifically they're fairly accurate. They get it wrong on elections occasionally, but on something like this, they're fairly accurate. That the majority of people in the United Kingdom now trust Labour more on taxation and trust Labour as a potential government more on economic competence than this Conservative government. I mean, that is quite extraordinary.
It's not...
Or maybe it's not.
Well, it's not surprising for any government that has been in power for a decade or for long that it gets criticism for anything. You very rarely have, in any country, a democratic country where you have a change of government every 4 or 5 years, where people would say, yes, the taxes are fantastic. You just don't really have that, unfortunately. People want more. People want lower taxes in general. There are, of course, differing viewpoints. But, you know, it would be easy to just blame the Conservative Party for all the wrongdoings. It's you know, people get tired with the governments. But I think looking into this crisis, which is crucial crisis for Europe and the peace of Europe, which is Ukraine and Russia, Conservative government is really leading the way, and for the whole continent to follow.
Yeah, let me come to you on that in a minute, but just sticking with Ukraine, because you wove it into the conversation. I found it intriguing when Kira Rudik, the Ukrainian MP, said to me, actually, things are as bad as they've ever been here. The Russians are prepared to send missiles into Kyiv when the Secretary General of the United Nations is here, and Donbass and the southeast is an absolute nightmare. the government can't trade on we're doing frightfully well supporting the Ukrainian people. She still wants aeroplanes. She still wants more equipment. She says it's as bad as it's ever been.
It is really us, the UK, the West, that told Ukraine, you are free to come closer to us if you want. And it was Ukraine's decision and the decision of the Ukrainian people that they wanted to be closer to NATO, to Europe, because they trust the West more and they have been frightened of Russia. Therefore, it's natural and it's our duty here in the UK to be supporting Ukraine today, because we told them you will be safe if you will be close to us, and they've listened. They've wanted to be part of that NATO family. We cannot blame them. You know, some people use this silly argument, it's NATO expanding and Russia is scared, but it is the particular countries, almost every Russian neighbor to the west of the country is frightened of them, and we ought to be doing more. We're not doing enough. There should be more support for Ukraine where it really matters.
I don't think, Alistair, if I may, it's about having airspace closed off. I think that argument has been and gone. And the Major General...
In effect, vetoed by America.
Yeah, yes, and I don't think that there was anybody of any real merit in the UK who was advocating it for understandable reasons. The Major General made a very, very important point when you were speaking to him about the escalation of rhetoric. And I think there have been a number of false steps in what otherwise, from a communications perspective, to maintain the unity within NATO and the European Union and with the United States and other like-minded, that has been quite playing down the rhetoric a lot. There have been mistakes. Biden lost his head over his remark, which was interpreted as a regime change. I think the Secretary of State for Defence made a mistake as well. He was talking about degrading Russia. That's maybe one of the outcomes and not an undesirable one. There's no need to make it a rule. And I think Liz Truss was ill-advised to be talking quite so firmly about our expectations of what a win would be like. A win is actually giving people in Ukraine some freedom. And let's dial down the rhetoric and make sure that we actually do keep control of this communications narrative. So I think it's really important. So those are issues that we've got to face.
I wanted to, because Major General said one thing, and I've heard this argument a few times recently, that we should be very wary of supporting Ukraine too much because it may push Russia to a corner and then they will be desperate and there will be a nuclear war. But what is the alternative? There is no alternative. It almost sounds like Chamberlain before the Second World War saying, you know, Hitler should maybe take a small land, and the policy of it's dangerously close. Some of those arguments are dangerously close to a policy of appeasement, saying Russians should just take half of Ukraine, it will be fine. It will not be fine because...
I think you're going a bit too far here. I honestly think you're going too far.
I am not...
Nobody is saying that Russia should get away with this. And when I'm talking about dialing down rhetoric, it's for good sense. It's for not panicking our own people, for example. I think we have to be very, very measured about what we do, and a degree of strategic ambiguity about what we say to Russia and when we might draw a red line is really important. And I think in terms of the munitions going in, that's important as well, because it's a defensive action by the free world, not just NATO, by the free world to support Ukraine.
We're going to have to stop it there, but I don't think either of you would disagree with this final observation, and that is that we also have an agenda from Zelensky, and that is no negotiation. It has to be victory, because if he loses, Poland is next, Moldova is next, Estonia is next. So I tell you what, come back another time and we'll move on to that on what the agenda is.
What you said is so crucial. There are military experts in Russia, journalists who are outspoken now. They are not afraid to say we should go for Moldova next and maybe the Baltic states. You know, it used to be funny some years ago, but now it's becoming close to reality.
Transnistria, maybe. You put a boot on NATO territory, and that is a very, very different...
Jonathan and George, brilliant, both at noon and just now. Thank you very much. I hope you come back soon and we'll carry on these conversations. That was Jonathan Haslam, former Chief Communications Secretary to John Major, and George Brzezinski, who's the Chief Advisor to the UK Parliamentary All-Party Group on Poland. Now, let's talk a little bit more about energy, and I'm delighted to be joined now by Professor Michael Bradshaw. Michael is Professor in Global Energy at the Warwick University Business School. And in a moment, we'll be also talking to Andy Mayer, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Let's start with you, Michael, if we may. Where are the markets suggesting oil and gas prices will be come October? Because the narrative seems to be, oh, it's bad now, but you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to be worse in October. Do you buy that?
I think it's very difficult to tell. We're entering the summer months for when gas demand is lower, and prices settle down. And prior to the announcement by Putin last week on Bulgaria and Poland, that the price had come down. But actually, compared to the long-run average, the price is still very high. So I think we can expect that the price will remain high. And come October, we're going to be in a situation where we're reviewing the gas, Ofgem's reviewing the gas price, and there may be further increases. But it's a global industry, and much depends on what happens in other parts of the world. I think the oil price is a different matter. The oil is much more of a fungible commodity. You can easily find alternative sources of supply. The market is tight. But I think on the demand side, there's as much uncertainty, particularly in terms of what's happening in China with the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. That's depressed oil demand. So we've got basically a very volatile situation that continues with the underlying prices compared to the recent average prices very high.
Sure. In your view, Michael, staying with you for a moment, if I may, you talked about getting alternatives is fairly straightforward. The world is awash with people who say, start fracking now and throw open the North Sea again. Is that wise?
I think they're two different things. I think when it comes to the North Sea, we already have an established infrastructure. We have companies operating in the North Sea, but it is a mature basin. It's already in a process of decline, and I think it's going to be very difficult to arrest that decline. But the government's had a long-term policy of trying to maximise economic recovery from the North Sea. I think onshore, in terms of shale gas, of course, the government is asked the British Geological Survey to look at the evidence around the moratorium, but it's not an overnight solution. And I think government ministers have also said it will only go ahead if communities are happy for it to do so. And I don't think there's any evidence that's the case. So I wouldn't see fracking as part of the answer. And it will take time to realise any benefits from new licensing rounds in the North Sea. Much more effective in the short term to focus on trying to reduce demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And easing the burden on those who are making that demand, which is a perfect cue to bring in Andy Mayer, Chief Operating Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. If the government were to try and do more to help people, and that includes businesses as well as individual citizens with those rising energy costs, one suggestion is a windfall tax on the massive profits that the oil companies are making, and that is now very popular amongst the public. You say it's economically illiterate.
Well, we do. It's generally the sign that the government has run out of ideas when they're thinking about introducing arbitrary taxes on sectors or individual companies, simply because they don't know where else to get the money from. Money they themselves could be enjoying in much greater depth had they not conducted the policy they conducted on both fracking and the North Sea. But it's quite important to remember that they actually do have a windfall tax on the North Sea already. It's the ring-fenced corporation tax and the supplementary charge, which means that when normal companies pay 19% this year on their corporation tax, the oil and gas companies in the North Sea will be paying 40%. That's going to raise, the Office for Budget Responsibility says, about £8 billion this year and about £3 to $4 billion last year. So any politician commenting on this issue really should be starting from the point of saying, what is it they are going to do with that windfall money they have already got? And if they don't have an answer, they're just not serious. They're just flanneling around looking for things to tax.
Let me bring Michael Bradshaw back in at that point, because Sunak clearly is giving it some serious consideration, because he's even used the language of saying, unless you oil companies invest in the future, all of those things that you were just describing, then you will be hit by this tax. Does that worry you as an observer and commentator on the industry?
I'm not sure it worries me, but I think they have to understand the consequences of actions, because this is an international industry. The North Sea has to attract investment in terms of global competition, and the majority of actors operating in the North Sea are not UK-based companies, and they have options to look elsewhere. So I think there's a delicate balancing act here. And of course, the government also wants to try and square a new licensing round with its net zero climate ambitions. So I think the problem may be, at the end of the day, you make the North Sea a less attractive place to invest, not a more attractive place.
Sure. Final question to Michael, and then I'll come back with a final one for Andy. We were talking to George and Jonathan both at midday and at 1 o'clock about the general political political scenario. In your view as an academic, is it trickier for a government that's surrounded by allegations of scandal and members of parliament going onto their mobile phones to look at pornography to have the authority that the oil industry will sit up and listen to anything that they say to them?
I'm sure it doesn't help, but I mean, the industry has multiple stakeholders that it has to listen to, including its own shareholders, the people who work for it, and society more generally, this whole notion of a social license. So I think it's a difficult balancing act. The government sets the regulations and creates expectations, but I think for companies, they have a wider range of stakeholders. And I'm sure they're not going to get involved in criticising a government for its other escapades, as it were. My own concern really is perhaps more that the government hasn't really grasped the nettle on the short-term challenges that customers face. I think the so-called British energy security strategy, and it does nothing for the problems that we face in the coming months and next winter.
Sure. Final point then to Andy. Do you believe that there are things that the government could do with it, even with its authority slightly damaged at the moment, that wouldn't involve windfall taxes and the rest of it, but would help get us through?
Well, ironically, one of the things they could do if they're in the territory of windfall taxes is have a good hard look at the renewable energy companies. What we've seen in the last few years, the last decade, is these companies have made 30 to 50% profits on the back of the policy imposed by the government on the electricity sector. So that's raising now about £6 to £7 billion of costs through the renewable obligation that we are all paying on our bills. And that's totally unjustified when we are seeing those companies also pay the wholesale price of electricity, which is the same thing as the gas price. So if the government were looking for a quick fix, they could bring in primary legislation to greatly reduce the amount of money being spent on pointless top-ups to very high levels of profits that these companies are making.
Andy Mayer, Chief Operating Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you. And before him, Professor Michael Bradshaw there on the right from Warwick Business School. Thank you both very much indeed for shedding informed light on a crisis that's facing pretty well all of us. Thank you very much indeed. We've more to come in the final half hour or so of the programme this afternoon. Alastair Stewart and friends after the break. A new task force has been set up to help deal with the supply shortage of hormone replacement treatment, HRT, here in the UK. But how do the manufacturers actually go about upscaling the distribution of these specific HRT products that women need most? We'll be discussing that right after this.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 27 minutes past 1. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends here on GB News. Now, we are hearing that Neil Parish, the Member of Parliament who has put his hand up to watching pornography on his mobile phone in the chamber of the House of Commons, but has referred himself to an inquiry, is likely to resign as Member of Parliament as those investigations carry on. A Conservative source has told PA News agency that is likely to happen later on today. We'll keep an eye on that, and you'll get all of it either with whichever programme is on air at the time or from Olivia and her colleagues on the news desk, so don't go away. Now, a new task force has been set up to help deal with the supply shortage of hormone replacement therapy here in the UK. There's been a shortage of some HRT products used by about 1 million women in the UK to treat menopause symptoms, with some women turning to the so-called black market to get their hands on the treatment. But how can manufacturers respond to that and try and go about upscaling the distribution of the specific HRT products that women most want? I'm delighted to be joined live in the studio by Dr. Shirin Lakhani, who is a menopause expert on it. You were telling me just before we had the break that one of the key problems now is actually women are much more well informed about what the problem is, how to deal with it, but also crucially, what the specific product and medicine is that they want. And they want that one, they don't want an alternative.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of media coverage about the menopause recently, and as a result, women are realising that there are differences in some of the products that have been prescribed. So there's a type of HRT called bioidentical or body-identical HRT, which has been shown to have less of the risks that were commonly associated with the older-fashioned HRT. And, I mean, the common estrogen, estrogel, is a form of this body-identical HRT.
Is that the one everybody's seen on television with patches?
Yeah, so patches are a form of estrogen as well, and most of the transdermal estrogen products are bioidentical or body-identical now. And because of the increase in awareness of the reduced risks of side effects and the better action of these medications, women are wanting their transdermal estrogens.
Sure. When we had biggest problems with the coronavirus and the pandemic, the work that was done by medics like you and also great universities like Oxford and AstraZeneca and all sorts of other companies to produce vaccines and get them out there in phenomenal quantities. The woman who's now running this HRT task force was involved in that whole process. How difficult stroke easy is it for a huge company like AstraZeneca or Glaxo or any of them to say, oh, right, OK, we're reading the demand, we'll up it and we'll get the production going?
I think with planning, they could have done that because the HRT shortage issues aren't new.
Oh, past tense, they should have seen it coming.
They should have seen it coming. This has been a problem. 3-4 years ago, there was an HRT shortage. And at that time, they should have recognised that there has been an increase in demand for over the last 5 years of women wanting to get help for their symptoms to remain productive in society. So I think there's been a huge failure on the part of the pharmaceutical companies to recognise and act in time. So the acute shortage we're seeing now is just the result of the long-term failures. They are saying that they will address these shortages by June, but in the meantime, women are suffering. They're not getting their medication. There are alternatives out there, but because of postcode lotteries, these aren't always available to all women. And we're also restricted because when a doctor writes a prescription, the pharmacist has to dispense that exact medication. So
That's the key point. And also Davina, to her great credit, and Penny Lancaster, Rod Stewart's partner, have been crystal clear. This is not an area where you want to risk shopping around. You've got to do it through a GP who knows what she, in your case, or he's talking about.
Yeah, and that's another issue, Alistair, because a lot of healthcare professionals haven't had the education they need to be able to support women. There are multiple issues with the management of menopause and women's health in general, and that's come from years of not prioritising it. I think campaigns like Davina's and others that are out there have improved education, particularly for the public and also for doctors and medics, and it's highlighted the lack of education and support there is out there for women.
The final question, and we're not doom mongers, and you made it crystal clear to me before you came in that you're not either. But there are issues of discomfort and difficulty for women who are going through this process. Is it potentially any more serious than that? I'm not belittling the fact that it can be uncomfortable, horrible and haunting, but it's not potentially fatal.
Well, for some women it could be, because HRT has been shown to improve life expectancy in women. It reduces dementia, it reduces osteoporosis, it reduces their risk of heart disease. And it's actually been shown that HRT improves the outcome for women in terms of heart disease better than things like statins and blood pressure medication.
So it's not just quality of life, it's actually...
It's not a lifestyle medication. It is about prolonging their lives. It's about reducing diseases that can lead to the end of their lives. And it's a hormone deficiency, much like diabetes or hypothyroidism, but it's not given the same importance.
Well, let's hope the manufacturers hear what you say and your colleagues in the medical world and do something about it so that more and more women are looked after. A great pleasure meeting you, and thank you very much for coming in,
Likewise,
Shirin.
thank you very
Good
much.
to see you. That was Dr. Shirin Lakhani, who is a menopause expert. Wise words to reflect upon there. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and Friends. We've plenty more still to come this afternoon in the last half hour, including we'll be seeing what the people of Nottingham think about the deployment of 8,000 British Army troops to Eastern Europe this summer. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the latest news headlines. Here again is Olivia.
Thank you, Alistair. It's 1:33. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. The MP accused of watching pornography in the Commons is likely to resign today, according to a Conservative source. Neil Parish has so far rejected calls to stand down, saying he'll wait for the outcome of a parliamentary standards inquiry. Caroline Noakes, who chairs the Women and Equalities Committee, accused the whips of dither and delay by taking too long to suspend him. The government is investigating reports an injured British man is being held captive by Russia. It's after an unverified video emerged reportedly showing Andrew Hill with a sling and a bandage around his head being interrogated by Russian forces. The Foreign Office is urgently seeking more information and is supporting his family members. Meanwhile, the US has accused the Russian President Vladimir Putin of brutality and depravity in his 2-month invasion of Ukraine. A Pentagon spokesman says violent and cruel acts have been committed against innocent civilians with utter disregard for their lives. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence says Moscow has been forced to merge and redeploy depleted military units after failed advances in northeast Ukraine. Police searching for a woman who went missing over a week ago in Lancashire say they've found a body. Katie Kenyon was last seen getting into a Ford Transit van in Burnley 8 days ago. Officers say formal identification is yet to take place, but the family of the 33-year-old mother of two have been informed of the discovery. An MP has accused Labour of hypocrisy for saying he was wasting police time by calling for an investigation into claims Sir Keir Starmer broke COVID rules during lockdown. The Labour leader is accused of drinking beer at a gathering in Durham. Richard Holden says Labour spent months calling for an investigation into exactly the same kind of events in Downing Street and Whitehall. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Alistair.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 23 minutes to 2. You're watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News. As we were talking about earlier on the programme, thousands of British troops will join military exercises in Eastern Europe this summer as Western countries boost their presence during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We spoke earlier to Major General Tim Cross about this, but how do you at home feel about it? Our East Midlands reporter Will Hollis joins us live now from Chetwynd Army Barracks in Chilwell in Nottinghamshire. So what's the buzz there? This is an important part of that community. These are important folk. What are you picking up on the ground, Will?
Good morning. Yes, if you haven't been watching the programme earlier, just as a reminder, it's 8,000 British troops that will be taking part in army exercises with NATO countries and Joint Expeditionary Force countries throughout the summer. So that's from now and the couple of months prior to now up until late June. There'll also be around 200 vehicles, so that's Challenger tanks, armoured vehicles and artillery as well. And that's really going to go along the eastern flank of Europe, so places like Poland, Finland, North Macedonia and Estonia and Latvia. So the Queen's Royal Hussars, they'll be joining and embedding with Finnish servicemen over the next couple of weeks. That will be starting now, and in total it'll be tens of thousands of troops from different parts of Europe and the US that will be taking part in these exercises. And whenever you go to places like this, like Chilwell, where there is an army base, there's always a bit of a connection, always a bit of an understanding as to how these people might be impacted if they're taking part in these exercises. So I've been speaking to people in Beeston, that's a town just down the road from the Chetwynd Barracks here, about how they feel seeing these exercises taking place over the summer.
First of all, I'd like to see a de-escalation. Obviously, everybody would. But in view of what's been emerging about the cares in the surrounding countries, to have support for them, I think, is very prudent, very essential. So it would be very good. I think it will also give some reassurance to the Ukrainians to know that they are not in this alone.
In my opinion, I served in Germany during the Cold War, when we had lots of troops to prevent Soviet expansion, and Putin seems to be carrying on very much the same attitude to expand the Russian Federation back to its old borders. So I think it's vital that we have troops there to deter his aggression.
Well, I'm glad to see the exercising, because I think they're going to need to go in, aren't they? It's just logic, that is. We've sat and watched it every day on the news, and it's horrendous. It's horrifying, isn't it? There's kiddies and everything. It's terrible, terrible.
Well, I think what they needed to do was a long time ago is start doing something to threaten them back a little bit, I think, more than anything, because they've just sent a missile straight into a meeting last night saying that it was full of arms and it was just a meeting conference place. So I think, yeah, they need to do something seriously quick, I think. Basically, there's a lot of innocent people getting killed, and it's all right bringing the people over here. I agree with trying to help them, but at the same time, our infrastructure can't take it, the hospitals can't take it, all the extra people here, it needs sorting out pretty quick, I think.
If we don't get actively involved, and if we're just showing that we are willing to keep a presence in the area, and that President Putin's actions and statements and not scaring us. And I think that's something, yes, we should be proactive in saying that we will not bow to people bullying. But, especially the last few decades have proven, becoming involved in other countries' issues have been very problematic for both ourselves, the USA especially.
Well, you can see lots of varying opinions, lots of people who don't want to see an escalation in this conflict, don't want to see Britain get involved. You've heard people mentioning things like alluding to the Iraq war, to Afghanistan. But you also see how people do want to support Ukraine, and they do want to help end this Russian aggression on the continent.
Will Hollis there, thank you very much indeed. Our East Midlands reporter there with the thoughts of some of the people living in that military town in Nottinghamshire. Now, we've been speaking about the cost of living crisis here in the UK, plus how the European gas trade's affecting us at home. My final guest is a good friend, top businessman, and a big thinker on these matters. He even established his own Institute for Prosperity, something I suspect that we could all do with a little bit more of right now. Sir John Mills, very good to see you as always, and thank you for finding time for us this Saturday afternoon. Let's start off, Cam, with the cost of living crisis. We've both lived through oil crises and financial crashes. Is this as bad as you've seen, John?
I think it is pretty bad, and I think it's likely to get worse over a period of time, because we've got some very heavy costs coming down the track on climate change, on healthcare, on social care, on pensions, and now we've got to spend more money on military activities as a result of what's happening in the Ukraine. So there's some very heavy costs coming down at the same time as the growth rate that we're likely to have over the next few years is very poor. And these two coming together, I think, are really what's undermining living standards at the moment. The immediate impression people get is prices going up more rapidly than wages, and that's what's happening. But the underlying factor is that there just are not the resources available to maintain the standard of living which we've been used to having. Yeah. And that's, I think, a real problem.
Jonathan Haslam, who used to work on communications at Number 10 in the John Major days, said earlier on, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, had choices and he made them. At least he was honest about that. I can't do everything, he said. Do you believe that economically he's made the right short-term choices?
I think, broadly speaking, he probably has. I think he did a good job during the pandemic period. I think now we're running into more difficult territory. The question about whether you try and cut back, raise interest rates and so on to get inflation down. Because I think the problem with doing that is that we're likely to make the growth rate lower and lower. And that's going to undermine the problems, make it more difficult to get living standards maintained, increase the pressure for wage increases and inflation. I think we're in dangerous territory.
How dangerous?
Well, I think we can see inflation taking quite a long time to come down and living standards just stagnating. And I think the problem then is that you get more undermining of moderate opinion, you get more drift towards populism and solutions which don't really work and a generally discontented population. And this is a real problem, I think, for the West, not just for the UK. And if you look at the world over the next few years, if you get China growing at 5 or 6% per annum, India and other countries in the while we're managing 1% or not even that, I think that's a dire outlook.
Yeah. Ian Martin, who writes in The Times but also has his own reaction website, would add one other thing to that list of concerns that you articulated a moment ago. And he said what's happening in China with the effective shutdown of Shanghai and now real COVID concerns in Beijing, if you begin to take China out of the equation, we really are looking at not just a domestic challenge, but a global challenge.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, you have got countries like India, which are growing very rapidly, as well as countries like China. But I think China's in a real problem because it's made the wrong call on how to handle COVID. And I think that it's going to be very difficult for China to kind of reintegrate itself back into the trading world in the way that the West has rather successfully done. And that may curb China's capacity for growing, which will bring down the world growth rate, So that's another problem to add to all the other ones, as you rightly say.
One thing we were talking earlier on with the Institute of Economic Affairs and also Warwick University Business School, and that is the contentious issue of a windfall tax on the oil companies. It's at the heart of what Labour are talking about right now. They want an emergency budget as well to see it through. The Institute of Economic Affairs and the oil companies themselves, they would, wouldn't they, say a windfall tax is economically illiterate. But Rishi Sunak is saying to the energy companies, unless you invest in the long term, we may have to consider doing it. What's your view, John?
Well, I must say I'm uncertain about exactly the best way to go ahead there. I mean, I do think that the energy companies really do need to invest a lot more in energy production. And that's not going to be helped if there's a big windfall tax to reduce their profitability and their financial resources. But there is a danger that the country, the UK, gets a reputation for just jumping on anybody who makes any money and monitoring it all rather than allowing it to fructify with further investment. So I think there's a difficult balance to be struck there, to be honest with you.
Let me take you back to, as it were, where we started. And I talked about us having lived through and you running businesses and me reporting on it, previous energy crises, and we have recovered from it. I'm left for the first time in quite a while, even bearing in mind the banking crisis, that this genuinely is not only as bad as it's got, but if people are having to now, 60% of them, cut back on food, cut back on other essentials, all of that's demand. All of that's people sending in orders to manufacturers, to investors, to people inventing stuff. It really is both sides of a terrifying equation.
Well, I think that's right. I think the big difference between now and what happened in 2008 is that there was a financial crisis, but there weren't these huge costs that I referred to earlier on coming down the track to destabilise the situation. And just to repeat these, you've got perhaps 3% of GDP on climate change, a couple of percent on healthcare, a couple of percent on social care and pensions. We've cut our training budgets back, that's another 1%. We're talking about increasing our military expenditure. The trouble is all these costs fall on people's living standards eventually. A lot of them fall on the public sector, pushing up taxation. And I think we're in a new territory here with these additional costs on top of the underlying problems with inflation, which you referred to a little earlier on.
The new territory that we're in, John, is summed up by the opinion polls, and I know they don't always get it right, but they sometimes get a good snapshot of feeling out there amongst ordinary folk, and that is that most now think that Labour are ahead of the Conservatives on economic competence and Labour are to be trusted more on taxation than Rishi Sunak. I mean, that, in terms of public opinion, just ahead of local government elections, is a phenomenal turnaround.
Well, I think it is, and I think that this is a sign of the strength of the Labour front bench and their ability to persuade the electorate that Labour's a serious party with a real prospect of running the country better than the Conservatives. So we'll have to see what happens in the elections next week, but I think they may reflect a real change in sentiment among the population, which could be quite important.
Fascinating times. Sir John, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much indeed for finding time for us this Saturday afternoon. Best to both of you, and thanks for your time. Sir John,
a pleasure, Alistair.
Agreeing with me, not, I mean, the analysis is one other thing, but we're both of a certain age, and goodness gracious me, the challenges that you are facing right now are pretty well as bad as we have seen. That's my view. That was Sir John's view. But we asked you right at the beginning of the programme and just a few moments ago as well to have your voice heard, and you have been coming in loud and clear. Let's start off with Gemma, who says, events this week have once again shown that we can't believe a single word our politicians say. watching porn even by mistake, and Starmer and Rayner failing to correct that the media had been told that she was not present at Beergate, are just two more examples of blatant lies. I think lies is a bit strong there, Gemma, but that's what you've written, so I'll read it out. And then for the Labour Party to claim it was all honest mistake is beyond the pale. No wonder politicians of all parties these days are held in low esteem. Gemma, I wanted to read that one out particularly because that's what really worries me most, is you can analyse the crises that we face, and we did it with Jonathan and with George and just now with Sir John, but whether or not you still believe in our politicians on either side of the fence telling us what we need to do and what their solutions are, gosh, if they lose that, we've pretty well lost everything. Clive says, unfortunately, it does seem that Parliament is actually almost being targeted by unscrupulous and unprincipled people masquerading as members of Parliament. James says, nobody would have known what Neil Parish was watching if they hadn't blatantly invaded his privacy. Why do the privacy invaders think it's OK to spy on someone else's private mobile screen? Whilst it may be inappropriate to watch pornography in the House of Commons, it isn't illegal. James, I just want to point out, you talk about the privacy invaders. These were women, members of the Conservative Party, same party as Mr Parish, who were sitting next to him in the House of Commons when it allegedly happened first time, and also sitting next to him in the committee meeting where it is alleged that he did it. So I'm not sure that it's kind of professional snoopers or something like that. It's fellow members of Parliament. And to balance it as well, please don't forget that Mr Parish has now referred himself for investigation. And we also had that news that, in fact, he may be considering his position this afternoon. We'll keep across that. Let's go to Jackie now. I think that like most people, I'm just sick of MPs behaving like spoilt children, says Jackie. They need to stop calling each other silly names and running to teacher with tales all the time. None of them has the high moral ground. Leave the playground politics alone and just grow up. That's what's needed. Hillary, we now change the subject and let's have a look at what you had to say about Ukraine. This one is from Hillary. I quote, Putin is a man who has something very seriously wrong with him. He has started the war in Ukraine, and because the West is providing the weapons to help the Ukrainians fight Russia, Putin is now threatening to nuke the West if we don't stop providing weapons. He is an evil man who has to be stopped at any cost. I just underline that word, any cost, Hillary, because we've now had two retired senior generals on this programme say, I never thought there'd be tactical nuclear weapons in Europe in my lifetime, and both of them are now saying, I'm not so sure. That is really seriously worrying. Robert says, I find it quite sad when I hear reports that Russians only hear what its government claims. I've read that one out already, but I'll just remind you of it because it's a very good point. Are we any better? All we hear are second-hand reports from Ukraine, whether through your reporters or from our government. Well, actually, Robert, we did hear from a Ukrainian MP and also two Brits who've been out there trying to help on the Ukraine front. Patrick says the reason Putin is now in Ukraine for the second time, I think that's a back reference to the invasion of Crimea, is that the West did nothing when he invaded Ukraine 8 years ago. What would the West do when he sends his tanks into Poland? Well, I was delighted to meet George Brzezinski on the programme as one of my guests at both noon and at 1 o'clock, who fascinatingly said that those countries that used to be in the Soviet Union's sphere perhaps could have done more, perhaps should have done more. But I hope very much indeed that today you found all of my guests informative about what's going on in Ukraine, what's being done to try and help you if you're one of those lovely people who've said, I'm happy to have a Ukrainian refugee here, and two people who've been out there trying to effort that as well, and also top guests on the energy crisis and the oil industry. That is all, however, that we have time for today. I will be back tomorrow at 12 until 2, when we'll have another great lineup of guests as we discuss the behaviour of Parliament at the moment. Barbara Follett will be joining me to discuss that. Until then, a very good afternoon to you. Bye-bye.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking wet across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but dry for England and Wales. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into southwest England, and it's looking like a fine afternoon with plenty of bright or sunny spells. Feeling pleasant in the sunshine with highs of 14 Celsius. It's a similar picture across southeast England and the London area with plenty of hazy sunshine. Feeling warm with highs reaching 17 Celsius. Over to Wales, and splashes of rain will begin to arrive over Anglesey. Elsewhere, it should be dry with spells of sunshine, highs reaching 16 Celsius. The Midlands will remain dry.